My name's Phil, and I am very excited to take you through the perspective on mobile ad fraud that we've developed at Liftoff. And I think you're going to find that the way we see things is quite unique and hopefully very informative and actionable. And I'm excited because we're going to share with you some data that we've built up over the years, which allows us to kind of navigate the fraud landscape in the programmatic ecosystem. And this is the first time that we've ever shared this data externally in any form. So you are the first people in the universe to see it. And so I think you'll find it both very interesting and novel. And so just a bit of background so you can understand where this data is coming from. So Liftoff, we're this performance-based app marketing platform. And essentially what we do is we help mobile app marketers run user acquisition campaigns. In particular, though, those campaigns and all of our advertising activity is designed to optimize for post-install engagement. So we help app developers find, purchasers, users who are going to subscribe and perform other forms of engagement. And we work with some of the best brands in mobile. And so this is what we're going to cover. We're going to look at the programmatic landscape and see how much of it looks like fraud. And then we're also going to look through a few concrete ways to see fraud. So at Liftoff, we've developed some lenses that allow us to see fraud and avoid it on behalf of our advertisers. So we're going to look at two of those lenses today. And then that will lead us to a discussion of how does one fight fraud? How are we supposed to make sure that the ecosystem remains healthy and fraud-free? And as you'll see, it's really not a task that just a single company or a single technology provider can solve. So there's a lot here. I encourage you to just put down your laptop screens. There's going to be a lot of data. Hold on to your seats. I hope it's going to be fascinating. So just to whet your appetite, probably most people in this room already know that fraud is a big thing. It's a big deal. But just to put a concrete number on it in terms of magnitude, this is a number from VentureBeat. They estimate that in 2016, mobile app advertisers spent about $1 billion on fraudulent installs. That's no joke. That's a lot of money. And then in 2017, they estimate that number more than doubled. And so, as a percentage of the market, it is not a terribly high percentage, but in terms of absolute numbers, it's really large. It's a lot of money that is being wasted, or at least going into the wrong hands. All right. And so, to get into the numbers, just before I take us through what fraud looks like and where it shows up in the ecosystem, just to quantify how large the programmatic ecosystem is, it's very large. It's basically everything outside of the big walled gardens. So it's every other app developer out there other than Facebook, YouTube, and a handful of others like Snap. And so what that boils down to is that on any given second, there's about 1.5 million impression auctions happening, which means if you were to buy all of this inventory, you could show 1.5 million impressions per second, which is it's an awful lot. And that's across 910 million devices per day. That's what Liftoff sees anyway. Over the course of a week, we see a little bit over 2 billion devices. So, through this channel, you're basically able to reach everybody on Earth who uses mobile apps on their phone. And this is a pretty conservative estimate, but we'll use this for this presentation. We think that in 2017, it represents about $8.2 billion of advertiser spend. And in terms of publishers, the space, as I mentioned, this is pretty much all of the mobile app developers out there who monetize their app through advertising, and it's quite a few of them. It's over 250,000 publishers that Liftoff sees and can show ads on in any given month. And the publishers, in terms of inventory, follows kind of a power law distribution. And so, there's a few big publishers, but there's this incredibly long tail of everybody else out there. All right, so here's the money slide. I'll take you through this. We think of this pie of 100%, that about 71% of it is high quality inventory. It's legit. That's the inventory that is fraud free and that you want to buy. We think about 8.6% of this inventory is what we call high confidence fraud. So it's fraud that's like fairly conspicuous. You know, it's easy to detect. It looks like bots. It looks like fake traffic. And if you were to buy every single one of those impressions, you could spend about $700 million per year on just that slice of the pie, and you would get nothing for it because this is all fake traffic. There's another slice, about 3.5% of the market, that we think is low confidence fraud. So this is inventory that just looks suspicious. It's very hard to buy reliably. So for example, it might be users who don't have a device ID for some reason, and so you don't know who they are. And so you can't really tell the difference between a real person and a bot. Or it might be inventory coming from an app that is not on the App Store and never has been on the App Store in any region in the world. Which can happen, but it's a pretty strange occurrence. And so there's quite a lot of that inventory, 3.5%, and it represents about $300 million of potential spend if advertisers bought it. And then there's this third very large category, the slice in yellow, which we call spammy inventory. And so this is mostly low intent click spam. And what that means is that the publishers in this slice of inventory, the ad placements, they generate too many clicks for the value they're driving. They might generate maybe 200 clicks for every install, which is it's a very low intent click. And so we'll get into that in depth later in the presentation. And so I guess one takeaway from this is there's kind of a lot of money at stake, and scaling campaigns in programmatic does require some thought, some care, and some technology. Okay, so that was a high-level overview. We'll take a look at how Liftoff could even build a graph like that. How do we see fraud? How do we view it? And so at Liftoff, we have over 10 different lenses we use, which are built on statistical techniques and other metrics, which allow us to see various types of fraud. I'm going to take you through two in the interest of time. And also, these are two very interesting and actionable lenses. And it'll give you flavor for what fraud looks like and how it can be measured and avoided at scale. So the two lenses are hyperactive devices and click spam. So to start with hyperactive devices, what does that mean? Hyperactive device is a word I made up, but for the purposes of this definition, or purposes of this presentation, this is how we define it. It's basically devices which view thousands or tens of thousands of impressions per day. And nobody views that many ads. If you are able to do that, then you probably need to do something else with your life. So these are very likely bots. And another type of hyperactive which we measure is for users that we've shown impressions to, how often do they click on our ads? We like to think at Liftoff we're pretty good at what we do, but we're not that good. If you're clicking on every single one of our ads, then something is fishy. And so we would label those users once we have a large enough sample as being clicky or hyperactive. And so with that lens, we can take a look at where these hyperactive users and devices come from. And so here's a breakout by country. You might have thought that a kind of a small, emerging, less regulated, less policed market like India or Indonesia might kind of top the list in terms of having the highest penetration of this fraud. But that's not the case. The number one country that's most afflicted by this type of fraud is USA. And then there's Bulgaria, Sweden, Canada, Switzerland, Japan. It's a handful of some of the top markets in this space. And this shouldn't be surprising to anybody. Because if you think about it, if you were trying to commit fraud and you were going to build up a botnet or a server farm that can generate a lot of fraudulent impressions and clicks, you would go where the money is, right? And just today, it's the case that the US is the biggest mobile in-app advertising market. The CPMs are high. There's a lot of advertisers, a lot of demand. So it makes sense that this is where you'd spend your time. And so the point here is that, the takeaway is that this fraud exists, and this type of fraud that can be seen through this lens exists in pretty large numbers. And it's not, in terms of like geography, it's not some conspicuous region of the world that you can like detect and avoid. It's pervasive. It's across the entire world. Even more interestingly, if you look at the big traffic sources, where all of the inventory is coming from, the way programmatic works is all the publishers, or many publishers, work with a given exchange. And the exchange makes all of that publisher inventory accessible or easy to buy for companies like Liftoff. And so Liftoff works with many exchanges. This is a selection of the 10 largest that we work with. So it's sorted from left to right. So these are the top 10 exchanges sorted from left to right by how large they are, how many impressions they serve in a given day. And you can see here that every single exchange is afflicted by this type of fraud to some degree. Some more than others. I'm not sure what's going on with those 3 exchanges. We'll work with them to kind of clean this up. But the takeaway here is that there's no super clean, trusted inventory source that you can just go to and hope that it'll all work out. No matter who you work with, there is a fraud problem that needs to be addressed with a technical solution, a technology. But on the other hand, this is okay. This type of fraud is very easy to detect, and from our perspective at Liftoff, we don't actually. It's not really important that one exchange has a higher rate of fraud than another, because we're just going to use the same strategy just to avoid this entire set of inventory across all of the publishers we work with. But that strategy is really important, and it must be applied to pretty much every publisher and every exchange out there. Now, if you look at this by publisher, this is a similar graph. This is the top 50 publishers sorted by size from left to right. And the y-axis is the percentage of their inventory that's coming from hyperactive devices. And you can see that most publishers, have this problem, I guess, to one degree or another, but there's really high variance. Some publishers, some very large publishers, have hyperactive device rates above 30 or 40%. And so, those publishers, if you just bought all of their inventory wholesale, would probably be pretty low ROI. You'd have to bake that into your CPMs. But if you were to forego that publisher entirely, that would be a shame, because many of these publishers are very large and have plenty of high-quality users. They just also have a lot of, hyperactive fraud and spam. And so if you can segment the good from the bad cleanly, then you can achieve the most scale. And of course, that's what we try and do at Liftoff. In terms of total impact, this particular lens applies to about 6.2% of all impressions, which is a whole lot. And if you were to just buy all impressions from hyperactive devices, you could spend and waste about $500 million per year in 2017. And so, of course, we think it's very important to use every lens available to the players in this ecosystem to make sure that advertiser budgets and user growth strategies are not being eroded by this type of fraud. So that's the hyperactive device lens. There's another lens that we use called click spam, and this lens is more interesting, I would say, because it's more nuanced. Click spam is not necessarily fraud in a black and white sense. So what it means is that a given publisher or a given ad placement is generating a lot of clicks. So maybe they have a very high click-through rate, but they're generating very few installs from those clicks. And you might think, well, that's not a big deal. Maybe I just optimize my campaign for CPI, and it's cool. I'll just pay for the installs. But it has 2 problems. One is that it's a poor user experience. So just imagine, some user is using an app, and they see your ad, and they accidentally click on it 5 times. They go to the App Store 5 times. By the end of that, they're going to say, I hate this company. And that's going to be a bad brand event for the advertiser. And then secondly, though, if a publisher is generating lots of clicks, that means that they're going to, assuming that you're using click-based attribution, which most mobile marketers do, that means that the publisher is going to get an really unfair credit or unfair attribution for a bunch of installs that they didn't drive. And this is especially potent for the larger advertisers out there who have apps that are already popular and already have a high rate of organic installs. And so it is a very important problem to solve. In terms of how you can detect it, there are many metrics. 2 common ones are click-to-install rate and click-to-install time. I'm going to focus on the first one just because it's simpler and has fewer caveats. The click-to-install rate simply means if a user is clicked, at what rate do they install? So if you, let's say you had 100 clicks and a click to install rate of, or 200 clicks and a click to install rate of only 0.5%, that means you're going to get one install from those 200 clicks. In other words, 1 out of every 200 users that clicks is a high intent click and is going to go on to install. And that's terrible. And we actually see a lot of publishers with click to install rates that are that low. So for the purposes of these stats, the way we measure click spam is we label all publishers by whether they have a CTI less than 0.5%, and we call them click spammy. And it's just an arbitrary threshold, but it's a useful one, as you'll see. And in terms of what drives low click to install rates, really there's three things, but I'll focus on the first two. One is the type of ad format. Some are higher intent than others intrinsically. Some are harder or easier to accidentally click on. And the other is the publisher's UX. They might place an ad in a place that's easy to accidentally click on, or they may surprise the user with an interstitial when they weren't expecting it, or the ad might be misleadingly styled so it looks like native content. And so all of these factors can drive low or high CTIs. In the interest of time, we'll take a look at click spam by exchange. And again, you can see that this type of fraud, or at least spammy quality, affects all of the exchanges in the mobile app ecosystem. Some more than others. I'm not sure what's going on with exchange number 7 here. They've got kind of a lot of low quality spammy inventory. But nonetheless, for even the largest players in this space, there's quite a lot of inventory which, using my definition, you could label as click spam. And this represents a lot of opportunity for advertisers. You do want to reach out to the high quality users that exist in here. You just don't want to have to deal with quick spam. And so in terms of total impact, it represents quite a large slice of the mobile app market, about $1 billion per year if you were just to go spend on click spammy apps. And you would get some value from that. There would be plenty of real users in there, but especially if you're a large app, you would your metrics would be skewed. You would spend more than you really should. So you'd probably be ROI negative, and you would think that you're ROI positive. So what can you do about it? There's a few strategies that I've seen people take. One is to blacklist all publishers that look click spammy. So you could just take all the publishers that you've seen empirically have less than 0.5% click to install rate, you blacklist them. And that's valid. In so doing, you're probably going to decrease your scale by something like 10 or 15% because many of those publishers are quite large and do have valuable, well-branded inventory. Another thing you do is you can call up the publisher and say, hey, you got to fix your UX because you're annoying your users. They're complaining to me about my ads, and I'm going to stop spending on you because your inventory looks like fraud. Because you've basically just been too aggressive in terms of optimizing yield, optimizing click-through rate, which is something publishers will do, but unfortunately, it might achieve the wrong outcome. It might make their inventory look more like fraud than they intended. And so so you can do that. A third strategy that doesn't scale that well though. And so a strategy that we like to use at Liftoff is to use smart creatives to fix the UX for the publisher. Let me show you what I mean. So this is a creative that we've run across many exchanges, many publishers. And what you're seeing here is all the little black dots on this creative are clicks. Those are the locations that a user clicked on. All of the green dots are clicks which led to installs. So this looks really funny, right? This looks really conspicuous. You can see there's these 2 big black blobs in the corners of this creative. And that's where a lot of people are clicking. It's actually the majority of clicks for this creative. Why are people clicking there? It's because they're trying to click on the close button, and they missed. And so the publishers that implemented the kind of close buttons where this creative ran did a poor job. And so it's resulting in a bunch of accidental clicks. And you can see, conversely, if you look at the bottom of the creative, there's this wonderful area filled with green dots. And that is the call to action button. If you kind of prune out all the click spam, it turns out that users who really want to click on an ad, they click on the CTA button. It's awesome. It's fascinating. And actually, more precisely, they click right in the middle of the CTA button, very reliably. It's actually hard to see. There's quite a lot of installs coming off of that CTA button, and the vast majority of them are in right on the middle of that CTA button. So users are actually very accurate with their fingers. And so all this to say, if you are annoyed by the level of low intent clicks coming from a creative like this, you can fix that, and that's what we've done at Liftoff. And so there's a couple like relatively straightforward ways to fix this. We put large dead zones around the close buttons so that a user can't accidentally click on our creative when they're going for the close button. And that's just a better user experience for everybody, right? And it cleans up the signal. It removes all of those low intent clicks from the campaign. Another thing you do is just make the only thing in this creative that's clickable be the CTA. That's relatively straightforward. That's something we can do because at Liftoff pretty easily and scalably because we generate all of our creatives programmatically. So when we are about to show a user a creative, we kind of construct the creative in real time using HTML, and so we can kind of implement all of these tricks and techniques for click protection is what we call it, just to kind of make sure that we are transforming what was once click spammy inventory into legit inventory. And so we do this for a large slice of that yellow slice of the pie. And so the takeaway here is that hyperactive devices and click spam are two types of fraud which have pretty large magnitude, and they're very much worth avoiding, worth solving. But they can be solved with technical solutions, with good technology. You just got to make sure that if you're an advertiser, your campaign is being executed in that way, or else a decent chunk of your budget is probably going to some fraud shop. Okay, so those were a few concrete fraud lenses. Hopefully that gives you a flavor of how one can see fraud. And I've shown you kind of one small way in which fraudulent or spammy inventory can be transformed into good, legit inventory. But it takes a lot of technology and honestly a lot of data to fight fraud in a scalable way. And so I wanted to share my thoughts on what the mobile programmatic ecosystem looks like, and like why fraud exists, and who's equipped to fight it, and how they should be fighting it. And so I wanted to talk through three key players in the programmatic ecosystem. So there's the supply. These are the exchanges, the ad networks, the publishers. They're the ones that are selling inventory that advertisers buy. There's the demand part of this ecosystem. So these are technology companies that are doing user optimization, user selection, and campaign optimization. Companies like Liftoff, we're in that middle category. And then finally, mobile measurement platforms. So these are the folks that, like Attune and Adjust and Kuchava, who are measuring all of this activity and making sure that the strategy is being executed effectively, and also measuring the ultimate results that an advertiser gets from their spend. And so we're going to look at kind of what data is available to each part of the ecosystem and how they can leverage that data into fighting fraud. So if you look at supply, if you think about it, of course, exchanges have great data about all of the publishers on their exchange and all of the users who are being shown impressions and using the apps that are on their exchange. However, an exchange only has visibility into their own publishers and their own users. And so they can't really understand if what a user is doing. They can't build a holistic picture of what a user is doing, and they can't really compare their publishers versus other publishers who may be more or less legit or spammy or fraudulent. And if you think about app installs, the number, from the perspective of an advertiser, let's say like Lyft is is running a large advertising campaign. They're going to work with a given supply partner, a given exchange is going to represent a very small percentage of the users that Lyft is acquiring through mobile user acquisition, right? And so a given exchange or a given ad network has a pretty limited view on the full set of Lyft users in this case. And then in terms of funnel events, if you think about the user experience in advertising, the supply side of the ecosystem really only participates in the ad serving part of the funnel. So they see which users are seeing which impressions from which advertisers. They can also see which ads get clicked on, and that's about it. They have no idea if a given click leads to an install. And they do not know if that given install led to a purchase. They just don't have that data. And so, so if you think about like what can supply do, what can the supply side of the ecosystem do, the big exchanges, the big ad networks to fight fraud, there's a few things they need to do, a few responsibilities they have to make sure that this ecosystem and this marketplace like continues to grow strongly and continues to be a strong vehicle for advertisers. One is that they need to vet publisher quality. So if a small indie developer, comes to MoPub and says, hey guys, I'm the New York Times, send me some advertising campaigns, MoPub needs to be able to vet that publisher and verify if that's true. The second thing they need to do is make sure that the ad SDKs that are used by all of their publishers are locked down, because ultimately it's the supply side of this ecosystem that controls the user experience. Usually it's the exchange of the ad network that is playing back a video, if it's a video creative, or they're showing the creative that Liftoff generated, for example. And so if a publisher or some other bad actor can kind of tamper with that, then they could do things like stack like 10 ads on top of each other and appear to have 10x the inventory that they do, or tamper with the SDK such that they're able to like automatically click on ads. And so that's the exchange, that's the ad network's responsibility to make sure that that's impossible. If they do their job, that will help make some types of fraud impossible. So if you think about the middle category, demand, this is where Liftoff sits. There's actually a lot of data accessible to this part of the ecosystem. In terms of publisher and user data, from Liftoff's perspective, now that we're at scale, we see we're able to work with all of the exchanges and all of the major ad networks, and so we see everything. We see every user out there, pretty much, that's outside of Facebook. We see all of the publishers, and we're able to build up a really good view of who these users are and how they behave. Of course, we use that to do efficient optimization, but it also is a really important lens for fighting fraud. In terms of app installs, if Liftoff were working with Lyft on an advertising campaign, we would buy inventory across many different exchanges, and so we would see, Liftoff would kind of see quite a few of the users that Lyft acquires through mobile advertising, and that's a good data set. But we would not see all of the users. Of course, Lyft would work with a handful of the major channels. They would certainly work with Facebook and Google and Liftoff and maybe a handful of others. And so we wouldn't see necessarily the entire stream of installs that are users that are installing Lyft. But in terms of the funnel, the user funnel, Liftoff and DSPs are the ones selecting which users to show creatives to. They're delivering their creative and maybe measuring the in-creative experience, like how long a user watched a given video, for instance. And then, of course, the DSP or the demand partner is able to measure whether a user clicked, whether a user installed, and then if they're optimizing for CPA, they should also be measuring whether those installs became engaged, loyal customers. And so really, the data set is nice because it's the entire spectrum of the user's journey. And so I believe this is the most compelling set of data that's available in this ecosystem for fighting fraud. And so that's great. That's a great asset. At Liftoff, we spend a lot of time fighting fraud because we feel equipped to do so, and it's going to be good for our customers and good for the ecosystem. And so that means we have the responsibility to do a good job. And so the things that the demand portion of the ecosystem should be doing to fight fraud, number one is optimizing for CPA. You gotta optimize for CPA. So just focusing on kind of upstream metrics like impressions, clicks, or installs makes the campaign strategy and the optimization techniques vulnerable to lots of different types of fraud. However, if you're optimizing for CPA, it's really nice and convenient because it just makes a bunch of types of fraud irrelevant. For instance, incentivized installs. If there's incentivized installs which are generating really cheap CPIs but no purchases, that's just kind of baked into the optimization strategy of the demand partner. And so that just means you're, if the optimization engine is working, it's just going to be immune from that type of incentivized low-quality inventory. And the second thing to do is filter fraudulent bid requests, the likes of which we saw earlier in the deck. And so, third ecosystem quickly, the mobile measurement platforms. They actually have a very complementary data set to the demand part of the ecosystem. So your typical MMP does not really see all of the users and all of the publishers, or all of the users that have not yet installed one of their customers' apps. So there are 2 billion users out there. Lyft, for instance, does not have 2 billion users, so the MMP would not see all of those prospective users. However, the MMP does see, in this example, with Lyft as the advertiser, sees all of Lyft's users who install the app, and also what they do, whether they book a ride or not. And so that's a very important and powerful data set. And then in terms of funnel events, the MMPs are measuring what happens after the click, and that's good. But they do not see the metrics related to what happened at impression time and what the user did with the creative, how many impressions they saw, that type of thing. And so the responsibility of the MMPs is to be in a strong reporting layer to hold the rest of the ecosystem accountable. And so the MMP can't necessarily prevent fraud directly because they're not the engine by which users are being targeted and which creatives are being shown to or being delivered through. But they can report on all of the advertising activity after the fact, and that is important for holding everyone else in this ecosystem accountable. And the second thing that all MMPs must do is they must make their products tamper-proof. It's pretty simple contract with an MMP. They measure clicks and they take install postbacks from the advertisers. This stuff has got to be completely locked down and tamper-proof. And unfortunately, it's not. As far as I know, none of the MMPs, other than one, have kind of tamper-proof click URLs, and so and install postbacks. And so this is kind of like basic security 101. It's something that this part of the ecosystem really needs to solve now that the market is at a very kind of a large scale and it's very lucrative for fraud. So we should expect to see higher incidences of fraud. It goes with the territory, but it comes with the territory of a large marketplace. But the takeaway from this slide and how we see things at Liftoff is that fraud, is a problem of large magnitude, and it is technically tractable to solve. It just can't really be solved by one player. Every player in the ecosystem needs to do their job, and all of us need to work together. So the MMPs need to work with the demand folks, and the demand folks need to work with the supply partners to make sure that we can continue to scale this ecosystem and this marketplace and have it be a good, valuable, important vehicle for mobile app marketers who are trying to grow their businesses. All right, let me stop there. Thank you very much. So I think we've got a few minutes for questions. I'm happy to answer any questions I can about fraud, about the ecosystem, about programmatic. Anything's fair game. So feel free, have at it.
Yeah, so just a quick question about your creative optimization. Maybe I misunderstood what you were saying, but you showed the heat map essentially where people are clicking. Now, are you suggesting that when you have to optimize the ad itself, you're removing the ability to close the ad and only the call to action is the only clickable item on the screen?
Sorry, I had trouble hearing it, but I think you're asking like how exactly did we implement click protection?
Yeah, so are you removing the ability to like X out of the click out of the ad?
Oh, okay, got it, yes.
That's really the question.
We are not removing the close button. That would definitely piss off a lot of users, of course. It would be a poor user experience. We just want to make sure that if a user wants to click on the close button and get rid of the ad, they do so without a high rate of accidentally going to the App Store, because that's not good for anybody.
Great. More questions?
There's one right here.
So how do you feel about view-through attributions and kind of the long view-through attribution windows, especially what you see on something like Facebook, where they often claim half the users are coming from view-throughs?
Great question. I feel very passionately about that. So view-through attribution is, for those of us that are unfamiliar, this is measuring the impact of an ad just based on showing an impression and not where a user didn't click. And so, so view-through attribution is a useful tool because it allows you to measure some of the additional kind of benefit from your advertising. So it might change your KPIs, it might change it might give you more data and more insight into what's happening, what's the impact of the ads you're showing, which might allow you to make good strategic decisions. But it does come, fraught with a few problems, one of which is it's just a lower intent form of attribution. If a user saw your ad and installed your app a day later, like, yeah, there's some link there, but it's weaker. It is weaker than click-based attribution. And so in terms of attribution windows, I think they should be relatively tight for view-through attribution if you want to use view-through attribution. And so something like a day is an industry standard, and it makes intuitive sense. Anything longer than that, and you've really got to have two beliefs. One is that there's a lot of value that you're missing out on with a shorter window that you want to measure for some reason, maybe for strategic purposes. Another is that you have to be confident that there's not a lot of low-intent views in your advertising campaign, because that's the key, right? If an advertiser or if a publisher can just generate lots of really low-value impressions that are coming from hyperactive devices, for instance, and they're really cheap to buy, then it will look like your view-through attributed advertising activity is driving a lot of value, but it's not. So you need to make sure that the impressions are high intent. And so that's another form of fighting fraud, which we didn't go into today. But what you need to do then is just make sure, again, that the impressions are high intent, and you can do that by actually looking at clicks and using that as a proxy for whether the impression was low or high intent or not. Some ad formats are better at intent than others. So like video is a classic example. If video is an expensive ad unit to buy, and so it can be hard to achieve real efficiency with it or large scale. But it does have one great property, and that is really high intent. Because if a user watches a 15-second non-skippable video and completes the thing, then they're pretty, at least pretty well educated about what your product or service is, and that's great. That's not really true of other kind of other ad formats, which can scroll by the screen really fast, or an interstitial which you can click out of in half a second. And so for view-through attribution, it's even harder to do than click-based attribution. And so I think it's a perfectly valid tool for measuring one's campaigns. You just have to be even more careful with how it's used. Great question.
Great. Who else?
The question is, can I rattle off my top 5 favorite exchanges to work with? I like working with all exchanges. But I'm a publisher and I don't want to plug into everyone. Oh, you're a publisher and you don't want to plug into everyone. Good example, or good question. I think all exchanges, the reason there's so many exchanges exist is because they have different pros and cons, different benefits. So there are kind of region-local exchanges which are really have really good penetration in given markets, and they understand that market, and they have good cohort of publishers or good ad formats for that market. So it really depends, so the other key variable, so there's 3 variables. One is the market, the country that the exchange operates in. The second is ad formats, and the third is scale. So those are why so many different exchanges exist. They're better or worse at each one of those. So it depends on the publisher. So I pick the exchange which is best at the ad format that you care about, and also has the most scale, because what I mean by scale is the most advertisers like Liftoff plugged into it. So the big folks are MoPub and Google. They're very big exchanges. There are some others that are particularly good at certain formats, like video. There were kind of mobile-first, video-first exchanges. Others are very good at native. So it really depends on what the publisher's goals are. We like working with all of them because all of the exchanges, at least that we work with, are technically competent and have something to offer. So it's all good from our perspective. We don't have any strong preferences.
Great. Anybody else? Okay.
Hi there.
Howdy.
Can you shed a little more light on the main villain in this presentation, the bad actors here? I'm guessing it's likely to be a publisher with 100K to 500 downloads on a utility app or a very basic game. Are they the more fraudulent actors, or is it very widespread?
I actually don't have precise first-hand knowledge of what a bad actor looks like. I've never met them. I haven't done undercover fraud work or anything like that. I know there are people who do that. But what we've seen, as far as we can tell from the data, many bad actors are publishers who are quite nefarious. So they're not really legit businesses. They have an app and maybe they bought it from another developer, and they're just trying to optimize the heck out of it and get like, $1,000 a month from that thing, and they roll up a big portfolio of apps together, and that's kind of their strategy. And that's kind of a low quality tranche of inventory that you should probably label as fraud. And then, so like that happens, so there are some nefarious publishers. There are also like genuine, legit businesses that just kind of are too aggressive in optimizing the yield of their inventory. And so, the metric that publishers have been trained on for so long is CTR. Make your CTR better, that's gonna raise your CPMs, it's gonna bring more advertisers to you. And that was true in the online world, it's not true in mobile, it's the wrong metric. It's misleading, and so that's all they have though, so they'll optimize for that. And it kind of produces bad effects, as we've seen here with like click spam, for instance. And so I wouldn't call those guys like nefarious fraudsters. I would just say that their execution, how they're trying to grow their business and monetize their app is misaligned with what advertisers actually want. And so there needs to be some realignment. A publisher is never going to sell their advertising inventory on like installs or something. So it's honestly that kind of burden of alignment should be placed on other players in the ecosystem like Liftoff and others. And then I think out there there are also kind of bot farms, click farms, which are set up just to inflate the stats of a given app, and they're pretty easy to identify. I don't know like how they get engaged. Maybe they like look like they're some consulting firm or something that a publisher works with, and they help you optimize your yield somehow. But what they're doing is just generating fraud.
Great. More questions? Phil, I have a question.
Yes.
You covered this a little bit. Sorry, it's just me. You covered this a little bit, I believe. If I'm a buyer and I'm running campaigns that are not based on click or install, why does fraud matter to me?
Oh, if you're saying if you're running campaigns which are not based on click or install metrics, so you're saying like a pure branding campaign?
Or like a cost per engagement, cost per, so the top of the funnel isn't really a KPI for me, it's more engagement. I don't care how many people come into the app.
Sure, cost per engagement. So sorry, what do you mean by engagement?
So just engaging with the app. So if the priority is not on install or a click action, is fraud still a concern? So if I don't care how many people are in my app, if I'm not paying for a click or an install, is fraud still a concern?
Okay, so if you're only paying for actions, I think that is a great way to go. Like, do that. That is definitely the way to run a mobile marketing campaign. So you're immune to most forms of fraud. So like what you pay for is what you're going to get, and so that is great. The objective of the campaign is aligned with what you're going to get. So you just really honestly don't have to worry about fraud that much, which is, CPA optimization has always been our product and our strategy at Liftoff, and so we've had the luxury of just not having to, or just automatically, just through the normal course of the day, avoiding all of the kind of large-scale fraud that afflicts other players in this space, with one exception. So one form of fraud that you do need to be concerned about is fraud which can wrongfully attribute actions to your marketing spend. So click spam is one. There are others like view through attribution fraud, and so that form of that type of I guess you could call it fraud, but that type of misattribution is important to make sure that the results are tight and the intent is high, so that you have as high a level of confidence as you can get that the advertising spend really did drive all of those actions.
Great.
Cool.
Okay, well let's thank Phil Crosby from
Thanks, everyone.
Liftoff.